With the recent release of X-Plane 11.20 beta, there have been many questions asked on social media about native VR. I thought it might be helpful to provide my thoughts on the top 10 questions about X-Plane 11 native VR beta. Let's get right to the first question, which is, how do I install native VR 11.20 public beta? To install 11.20 for VR use, you're going to need three things: X-Plane 11.20 beta, an Oculus Rift or HTC Vive VR headset, and Steam VR. I highly recommend creating a second copy of X-Plane on your PC to keep beta versions isolated from your main X-Plane system, especially if you're using Flyinside for VR currently. You're also going to need to install Steam VR, which is a VR API that X-Plane uses like many other VR games and apps. You can download Steam VR from the Steam website. Next, install 11.20 using the X-Plane installer tool. Since 11.20 is beta, you'll need to select Check for New Beta as well as Updates before installing. Then choose the copy of X-Plane you wish to upgrade. Laminar Research also suggests deleting preferences after upgrading. You can check out my video on how to do this. Once you've installed your VR headset software, Steam VR, and 11.20 beta, you're ready to go. Is the 11.20 VR beta version stable? As excited as we all are about native VR, this is a beta version and a VR preview. It's important to understand that 11.20 is a work in progress. There's a strong possibility you can encounter problems, and Laminar Research asks that you report any issues you have using their bug reporter. This is why I highly recommend having a second copy of X-Plane on your PC if you plan to try out beta releases. Do I need touch or Vive controllers to use X-Plane native VR? In its current form, the answer is yes. X-Plane native VR requires motion controllers to access menus, set configuration parameters, and to access instruments in the aircraft. Laminar has said they are looking at adding other input methods such as mouse control and using motion controller laser pointers, and you can currently use yokes, sticks, and pedals while flying in VR. But again, you will need a touch or Vive motion controller to use VR in the first release of 11.20 beta. Why is it called native if you need Steam VR? Well, first, native VR is a term that has its genesis from the X-Plane community. Laminar uses the term VR support to describe this feature of X-Plane 11. Think of Steam VR as a common interface that VR games and apps use to connect their software with VR headsets. Using this common interface, or API, saves developers the time and expense of creating their own interface. Without Steam VR API, we could have been waiting a lot longer for X-Plane VR support. Why do I get judder or stuttering when flying with native VR? X-Plane 11 VR requires your PC to produce at least 45 frames per second, so it can upscale this to 90 frames per second, which is what your VR headset requires. If X-Plane dips below 45 frames per second, you'll begin to see judder or stuttering of the image in VR. The lower your frame rates drop, the worse the judder will get. When you first use X-Plane VR, start with a lower graphics setting and work your way up to find the max level at which your PC can maintain 45 frames per second. This will of course depend highly on which CPU and graphics card you're using. For my system, which is an i7 6700 CPU and 1080 Ti GPU, here are the settings that work best for me. The results will also vary depending on which plane you fly and where you fly it. Will a better graphics card improve X-Plane VR performance? With X-Plane currently running on the OpenGL platform, there is a limit to how fast the CPU can hand out work to your graphics card. Laminar has said that the GTX 1070 is the OpenGL sweet spot GPU for X-Plane. Adding VR to the mix puts additional pressure on your GPU. This means going to a 1080 or 1080 Ti can improve VR performance. However, you'll likely not see a major increase in X-Plane frame rate performance. Laminar has stated that they plan to migrate to Vulkan in 2018, which is an API that increases the ability of the CPU to communicate with the GPU and should improve frame rate performance. Will X-Plane native VR work with my plugins and custom scenery? As I mentioned before, 11.20 is a beta release. Personally, I'm running it on a completely clean environment with no third-party plugins or custom scenery. As plugin designers announce compatibility, I plan to test each one and add them once I know they work. I have tested 11.20 with a few Ortho 4XP tiles, and it seems to perform well. How does X-Plane native VR compare with Flyinside? This is the question asked most often and probably the most important at this point. Let's keep in mind that 11.20 is a VR preview and Flyinside has been available for quite some time. There are features that we're accustomed to with Flyinside, like mouse use, that are currently not in X-Plane 11 native VR. Personally, I will continue to use Flyinside for day-to-day flying because of these features. As native VR evolves and features are added, dependency on Flyinside will hopefully decrease to the point where native VR becomes the prime. Regarding visual performance, in my opinion, even at medium graphic settings, X-Plane 11 native VR is much clearer and provides smoother flight and seems to provide greater field of view than Flyinside. Which VR headsets can I use with X-Plane native VR? Laminar Research has stated that Oculus Rift and HTC Vive are the two VR headsets that are officially supported. They have also said that their goal is to maintain support of all mainstream and common VR headsets in the future. Is it worth buying a Rift or Vive to use X-Plane native VR? Well, this is the big question, right? Is X-Plane native VR experience worth dishing out the coin for a VR headset and PC that can perform at a level needed to deliver a solid VR flight sim experience? The answer to this question is really a matter of opinion, and I can tell you that since I began flying X-Plane in VR, I have rarely gone back to flying in 2D. And I've heard the same from many other people who now fly X-Plane in VR only. With X-Plane's early implementation of VR improving visuals and motion and Laminar's commitment to VR, to me, this is even more convincing. And keep in mind that when you invest in VR, you're also gaining access to many amazing VR apps and games that tend to blow people away. But in the end, you'll have to decide for yourself.